All right, you need to set up the next one. The next person that I'm going to bring up to talk about harm reduction and recovery. When I first heard his name and that he worked for SAMHSA, I put him up on this pedestal, and whenever I would talk about him, the lights would dim and whatever, and it just, I thought he was just walked on water. And got a chance to meet him, and Jimmy McGill will tell you about your hero becoming human, because I learned that he's just crazy as I am. In fact, probably a little bit more. And he has included me in some things that I don't know that I am necessarily qualified to be included in conversations all across the country about policy and things that he is working on, and I'm just so grateful. And so he will always have a space anywhere that I am. I'm talking about David Awadalla. Thank you.
Well, first off, Gerald, thank you for having me here. I know it's really late. Y'all are sleepy.
Hold it up a little bit here. Hold it up.
Like that. All right, can you all hear me now? Okay. So I know everyone's looking pretty sleepy. As Gerald mentioned, I work for the federal government, so if you're going to take a nap, now's the time to do it. So it's funny, it's because I struggle with the same stuff everyone else struggles with. When I hear that kind of stuff that, people put me on a pedestal because of my position, it's the opposite for me. I struggle with humility in the sense that sometimes I feel like I don't belong in the role that I have. So I just want to acknowledge that we're all human at the end of the day, and my self-worth is, or lack thereof, is kind of what brought me to the path that I'm on in many ways, which I'm fortunate enough to talk about that. So, as Joe mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Office of Recovery and some of the work we're doing to advance recovery across the nation, but also talk about some of the harm reduction work that we're doing. And we actually had a really difficult but productive event a couple of months ago in Denver, Colorado, where we brought together the recovery and harm reduction communities. And we had some tough conversations, but we had some really necessary ones. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the findings from that meeting as well. And then hopefully we're going to have some time for the future. So first things first is a disclaimer, because sometimes, actually all the time, I say things that are not representative of the federal government, and I say things that will get me in trouble. So that's why that slide exists, so I can cover my ass. Quick introduction. So I'm from Georgia, Atlanta. Went to the University of Georgia. Go Dogs. Georgia's actually playing right now. I've been having a hard time not looking at my phone and keeping up with the score of the game. But that was back in 2005 when I was a freshman at UGA. I took a forced hiatus where I worked for the Georgia Department of Corrections, free labor. I'll tell you more about that. Went back to UGA. When I started working in the field, I worked for the Florida Association of Recovery Residences doing compliance. And then went on to get my master's at the University of Michigan. Also did some, did I hear a boo in there? Ohio State fans, I see. Go Blue. So, also worked as a clinician at Down Farm, which is a small nonprofit treatment center in Ann Arbor. Worked for a company called Legit Script. Then I went on to work for the state of Michigan. Finally, I went to the federal level as a contractor, and now I'm at SAMHSA. But that's my professional story. So, similar to many people in this room, I have felony convictions. I spent time in prison in Georgia. So my path to where I'm at now wasn't very straightforward. It was not a linear path like a lot of my colleagues that I work with. And, you know, so I'm very fortunate because for about 4 years of my life, and 2 years straight, I was referred to by my GDC number, which was inmate 10,66908, which is a number I would never ever forget. And I remember walking, you know, Eric was kind of talking about that moment of hopelessness that we feel where, you know, we make that change. And I had a lot of those, honestly, in my kind of journey into recovery, like, I had moments of hopelessness and surrender that didn't work, if I'm going to be honest. Because, you know, I got out of prison in 2013, and you'd think that after getting out of prison, that would be enough, and that would be kind of like the spark that you need. And for me, it wasn't. I was shooting dope again within about 6 or 7 months after my release. And, you know, luckily I didn't get arrested again, but I almost died multiple times. And, you know, for me, it took a lot. It took access to harm reduction to keep me alive. It took quality clinical services. It took buprenorphine, MOUD. It took recovery housing, recovery support services. It took community and family and peer support. And it took finding my purpose and keeping my purpose. And that's my recovery right there, and it continues to be my recovery. And you know, some of those were part of my pathway to recovery. Some of those are my pathway of recovery, and I practice those now. And so that's why I'm in a privileged position to be talking to you today. And that's why I get to work and somehow, as a convicted felon, work for the federal government, which, if you ask me how that happened, I don't know. So you go through a background investigation, and it's usually you speak to an investigator for like an hour. I had 2 4-hour phone calls where they were bringing up arrests that I had forgotten about. And so I had a lot of convincing to do, but the reason why I was able to do that is because of my recovery. And so I'm very fortunate. So I've had this slide on a lot of presentations. I'm going to have this slide until I'm 50 years old to just let you guys know someone tagged me as a hottie in one of my actions. So that was one of my biggest accomplishments of life. Okay, so moving on. Now I kind of mentioned like my role, and before I dive too far into that, some of the work that I get to do now for the federal government, I also want to acknowledge that recovery for me is also more. So these are some pictures that are really important to me. So at the top, that is my beautiful and intelligent and stunning wife who drives me every day to be a better person. Those are my 2 dogs, Annabelle and Dax, and then my nieces, Everly and Amy. And then this little shithead right here is Kai, and we just got him about 6 months ago, and he's a handful, but a blessing as well. So recovery is not just about working and making a difference in a career, but it's also about living life and enjoying things that I used to dream of, you know. And I can't tell you how many nights I would go to bed on a cot in prison with a drawer full of ramen, honey buns, and literally dream of this stuff. And then when it happens, it's kind of, you don't appreciate it sometimes. And so one of the things I try and do is, when I talk to people, remind myself how much this stuff means to me and how much it means to a lot of people. I also want to talk a little bit about my friend who I was incarcerated with, because this is a great example of kind of some of the failures of the system that we're seeing. So that's Tyler. We were locked up together for 2 years, and we were homies in the system. We liked the same music, we played cards together, We both had kind of like the same problems with addiction, and our stories in many ways were very similar. But Tyler didn't have access to a lot of the services that I had when I got out. And I remember there's just so many opportunities for him to be introduced to certain systems and services when he was going in and out after I had been released and he had been released, but I had found recovery. And unfortunately, the system literally didn't allow him to. We actually were able to get him a scholarship to a recovery housing program in Florida, but the state of Georgia would not allow him to transfer his probation, so he ended up staying, and he ended up passing away about a year ago. And you look around these rooms at all these people that we've lost, and the worst part is they're all preventable deaths, all the people that we're losing. There's no way to describe something that is more preventable than Tyler's death. And it's just a good reminder of the work that we have to do. So if you want to read a little bit more about Tyler's story, you can actually pull up a blog post that I wrote. It's on the SAMHSA website. And I'll make sure that Gerald gets this slide deck so you guys can take a look as well. Now into the boring stuff that we do now. Just to acknowledge the HHS overdose prevention strategy, which highlights primary prevention, recovery support, harm reduction, and evidence-based treatment as the four pillars or priorities within the strategy. And then also, I don't want to get into politics too much, but President Biden's unity agenda does highlight some really important strategies for promoting recovery and well-being. He identified the national certification standards for the peer workforce, expanded recovery support, overdose prevention efforts, including harm reduction, and then overall efforts to promote the well-being of the peer workforce. So, a real quick overview of our harm reduction efforts at SAMHSA. So, harm reduction is housed within our CSAP, our Center for Substance Abuse Prevention. So, OPI, which is the Office of Prevention and Innovation, provides subject matter expertise and leads our training and technical assistance efforts related to harm reduction. And they also contribute some funding to national TA efforts or training efforts for harm reduction as well. And then where I sit is in the Office of Recovery. We're a brand new office as of 2021, and we basically we were formed to advance recovery across the nation by making sure the voices of people with lived and living experience are part of the conversation and integrated into the policy that is affecting them. We also have a national recovery agenda that guides our work, advancing recovery across the nation, and that's to forge partnerships to support all people, families, and communities impacted by mental health and or substance use conditions to pursue recovery, be resilient, and finally achieve wellness. So I mentioned the birth of the Office of Recovery in 2021. In 2022, we brought together the field to help inform the office. And we came up with 5 goals. So inclusion, equity, peer services, social determinants, and then finally wellness. And these are all part, or they're born from SAMHSA's working definition of recovery. Who in here is a certified peer worker, out of curiosity? Okay. And then who in here is familiar with what peer support is? Probably everybody, right? Okay. So, does anyone know what the model standards are? Just a real quick show of hands one more time. Okay, just one, just Jimmy McGill. All right, so these were one of the first things that we did. And one of the challenges right now in the peer workforce is reciprocity. So if you're certified in one state, you might go through a training and certification curriculum that has 150 hours for certification, or for training for your certification. Then if you go to another state, you might have to complete 1,000 hours for training. And so the disparities between states are massive. And so basically what these standards do is try and promote consistency and encourage reciprocity between states. So if you're certified in one state and you want to move to another, you don't have to go through the entire certification program again. So these were developed with the peer workforce, and by the peer workforce, a lot of people with lived and learning experience, and essentially they keep those people in mind. That's what these standards are for. And we're really proud of the work that happened through that. I also want to acknowledge the National Model Standard on Authenticity and Lived Experience. So SAMHSA's working definition of recovery is guided by supporting principles and pillars, and I think Eric actually mentioned one of them. Another one is many pathways of recovery. And so in the first model standard, we do acknowledge that peers play a role in many, many settings, not just in RCO. So certified peers can provide mental health peer support, they can provide substance use peer support, they can provide peer support in a harm reduction organization, they can provide peer support in an abstinence-based treatment organization. And so based on where that peer is working, their role and their lived experience might be different. And so making sure that that's acknowledged in the state certifications is very important. And so that's the reason why this standard was written like that. And then also just kind of acknowledging the fact that people have different pathways of recovery. Like 5-6 years ago, buprenorphine and MOUD was not accepted everywhere, right? And there's still some barriers with it. And so making sure that states aren't dictating what a pathway of recovery should look like for certification is something that the field told us that we should include. So we did it. And then for the harm reduction framework, that was created a couple of years ago. And there's quite a bit of information. I want to kind of rush through this because I want to have a discussion with everyone. But if you haven't looked at our framework, please take a picture of that or pull it up with your phone. There's a QR code on the screen. And it really clarifies a lot of the misconceptions that I had about harm reduction and probably some of the ones that exist in this group. So this is the overview of the summit that I had talked about in Denver. And we're about to finalize really awesome document called Advancing Partnerships Across Harm Reduction and Recovery. And it really breaks down some of the myths and misconceptions and ideas that are floating around about between both sides, and talks about some of the similarities and differences that our communities have. And so I'm really looking forward to that release. I'll keep Gerald posted. You can send it out to everyone's emails once that's done. But for now, I'm going to skip through some of these slides and then go back to them because I actually want to have a conversation with you guys. Should have reordered these earlier. Okay, almost there. Okay. So this first question, what are some similarities and differences between recovery and harm reduction that you guys believe to be true? So does anyone have any thoughts or ideas about this first question? I know someone does.
I feel like harm reduction is the very first step to getting someone to recovery. It's a place where people can find that unbiased support and just compassion that isn't always present in their lives.
Very simply, recovery is harm reduction.
Okay. So, first person said harm reduction is a step before recovery. Second person said, what's your name? Laura, and then what was your name? Heather. And then Laura said that harm reduction is recovery. Okay. Got someone else back here.
I was just gonna say, there's multiple pathways to recovery, so whatever looks right for you is right for you. It's highly individualized, but they all work as long as you're moving forward and
Okay.
So my thought was maybe harm reduction is more of the action or the tool, and recovery is the process or the transformation.
Okay. Anyone else? Wow. You got some thoughts now.
For me, harm reduction is when you take a look at an individual and look at their different aspects of their lives, their environments, and do an assessment to see what is causing the problems. You know, try to eliminate the propensity to go back to addiction. So in order to have successful recovery for certain individuals, you have to eliminate a certain risk that's in their environment.
Okay. And then we got Jimmy McGill.
So they're both a lifestyle, right? Harm reduction is its own way of life, recovery is its own way of life. Some other similarities is both recovery specialist and harm reduction specialist, both are just trying to help individuals.
Where's Gerald at? I need someone to pass around this mic for me.
I was going to say, I think they're not mutually exclusive, meaning you can be in recovery and practicing harm reduction at the same time. I don't know if that's in conflict with what Jimmy said, but I can see a pathway where they're not mutually exclusive. And I also think they're both, neither of them are black and white, in recovery or not in recovery. I think there's probably a lot of, like others have said, a lot of individual ways to engage in both. Yeah, a little bit or a lot.
Great. So before we pass it one more time and go to the next question. So I heard a lot of different ideas and kind of concepts about the differences. And so I'm going to rewind real quick before we go to our next question. All right, so this seemed like a good idea. Maybe I should have thought about it better here. So in this slide, you can see the scopes of challenges related to substance use. So down here you have fewer challenges. So let's say youth who are experimenting with drugs but might not have a substance use condition, right? Then you got here, this is where you start getting into like moderate, severe substance use territory, clinical diagnosis maybe. That's where you'd have things like naloxone distribution for IV drug users, service programs, recovery housing programs. So the biggest, I guess the first thing that I think is important to look at is the scope and the size of the scope. Harm reduction is trying to reduce harms associated with drug use. So that's going to include people that are outside of recovery scope, right? So because recovery, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's for people who are having challenges related to substance use and or mental health. And usually those people probably meet some sort of clinical diagnosis, whether they're diagnosed or not. You don't seek out recovery support services unless you need recovery or have some sort of interest. So that's a good first step in understanding some of the differences in the services and approaches. Does anyone have any questions or thoughts related to that? No? So we also have definitions at SAMHSA that were that the field helped create. And so the one you're mostly familiar with is SAMHSA's working definition of recovery, which is a process of change through which individuals improve their health and wellness, live self-directed lives, and strive to reach their full potential. So SAMHSA's working definition of recovery is that's regarding our individual process of recovery. That's not defining the services or RCOs, it's just talking about recovery as a process. Down here, SAMHSA's definition of harm reduction is harm reduction as an approach, which includes prevention, risk reduction, health promotion, and empowerment of people who use drugs. So essentially what that means is keeping people who use drugs safe and healthy. Do many of those people go on to access recovery support services? Absolutely. Do all of them? No. And that's kind of an important point that we're going to talk a little bit more about in a minute. So we also have guiding principles for recovery. So right here is the 4 pillars or dimensions of recovery: health, home, community, and purpose. Who here has lived in a recovery housing program? Okay. That was really important for me. And then after I was done with my recovery housing program, living somewhere where I was safe and stable, where I could be healthy, where I wasn't around my drug of choice, and I wouldn't have been able to sustain my recovery if it wasn't for that. Purpose, which I talked about in my own journey, and then community. So especially really early on, my 12-step community was essential in my recovery. As I've kind of gone on with my career, it's kind of shrunk a little bit, but it's still an important part of my recovery and my life. And then we also have 10 guiding principles on the other side. So hope, person-driven, holistic, can occur via many pathways. So there's a saying, there's as many pathways of recovery as there are people in recovery. So everyone's pathway is unique to them. Everyone uses different tools and services and strategies within their recovery. So we also have guiding principles and pillars of harm reduction as well. And it's interesting because these were created by the harm reduction field. The other ones were created by the recovery field. Little bit of overlap, but mostly different people. But there's so many similarities. So autonomy, acceptance, support, community, many pathways to well-being, practice-based evidence and on-the-ground experience, relationships, assist, not direct, safety, engage, listen, systems change. And then, similar to recovery and the value of lived experience in recovery, people who use drugs and with lived experience of drug use, inherent value of people, community engagement, reparative social justice, accessible and non-coercive, and then focuses on any positive change. And so there's some differences, but there's some similarities as well. So I also want to acknowledge that harm reduction, prevention, treatment, recovery support services are separate parts of the continuum, but overlap can exist. And the most important thing that will tell you if there's actual overlap happening is whether the guiding principles are the same and the population of focus. So oftentimes I feel like people assume that harm reduction equals drug use. Has anyone heard the term harm reduction and thought drug use before? Because I have. Anyone else? You guys are nervous to raise your hands on that one. I personally I've, in the past like 3-4 years working in the field and meeting some of the harm reduction experts, I've learned a ton. And I used to have some opinions about harm reduction that were based on, now that I look back, misunderstanding. And one thing I've had to get out of my head is that recovery means one thing and harm reduction means one thing, because it's not that simple. And it's a complicated continuum, right? And sometimes our brains just oversimplify, and that's just human nature. I also want to acknowledge that RCOs, who knows what a CHIRP is? Anyone know what a CHIRP is? Okay, so a CHIRP is a community-based harm reduction program. It's basically harm reduction's version of an RCO. So in the recovery field, you have RCO, the recovery community organizations like Sauk Valley, and then you have CHIRPs, which are essentially providing all the continuum of harm reduction services. And so recovery support services and those services that are provided in RCOs are non-clinical all the time, right? However, RCOs can provide clinical services, but they wouldn't be recovery support services. Similarly, CHIRPs provide non-clinical services, but harm reduction can be clinical treatment. So low barrier medications for opioid use disorder, that's a harm reduction service. HIV, hepatitis testing and treatment, that's a clinical service, but also a harm reduction service. And so you have these similarities and differences that can be, all right, I got 10 minutes, that can be confusing. And so that's okay. It's okay that it can be confusing. So I talked a lot about that, and now I'm going to go back to our questions, and I want to get some thoughts on our second question. So can anyone think of something that can be a recovery support service and a harm reduction service?
Matt.
Naloxone distribution. You want to say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think distributing Narcan is a recovery support service. It's harm reduction. It keeps people alive, so they can engage in recovery if they choose to. I think people who decide to continue to use and choose to do so safely are, in a way, engaging in recovery. You know, maybe not in the way everyone would wish that they would, but yeah, I think that's a great example.
Yeah, so that's a really simple one, actually. And we all know RCOs that pass out naloxone, and naloxone was one of the original harm reduction strategies. Before it was even legal, the harm reductionists were passing out naloxone into their communities, usually with syringes, like sterile, because there wasn't the nasal spray back 10, 20 years ago. Well, 10 years ago, but 20 years ago there wasn't. And so they're passing out vials of naloxone and syringes. And so that's a perfect example. Anyone else?
Another simple one is just this, what we're doing right here, I feel like.
What do you mean?
Just a convention, a recovery support convention.
Okay.
I think it's educational and gives our whole community, every one of us is taking home stories that we can use to help aid in the harm reduction.
So community building and education. Love it, yeah. So,
Peer support.
peer support.
Yep.
Yep.
I agree, absolutely. Access to resources in
Mhm.
the local community, food, shelter, education,
Yep. Yep.
support.
And so that's the thing is, there's so many different recovery services. What are some of the recovery support services you provide at Hope Recovery Community?
We provide peer support, basic needs. We're working on a vending machine that will have Narcan, fentanyl test strips, wound care, transportation, treatment navigation, jail peer support, child welfare peer support, all in the focus of reducing harm, minimizing harm, and connecting people to the process of wellness that they so choose.
And so a lot of those, like FTS, xylazine test strips,
Yeah.
the lock zone, those are all harm reduction activities. And so at the end of the day, there's so many similarities that we have with the harm reduction community. And that's one thing I've learned through this work is all our friends are dying in both communities. We're trying to do what we can to save them. And it's just some misunderstanding that exists, right? So anyone else have?
I grew up in like the tough love environment, so harm reduction is the opposite of tough love for me. So I'm encouraged by the new harm reduction where it meets us where we're at, instead of stigmatizing us for the rest of our lives, which is what I experienced. So hopefully it'll be a bridge to the future.
I appreciate that, and that's, I think another difference that we can see is some RCOs, and that's fine, it's an essential service. They are focused on providing a recovery community, right? And so they might encounter someone who's not ready for recovery. And so just making sure that that person's needs are met, they're either met within that organization or they have a network and they can refer that person out. So, all right.
I think the greatest service that happens in both groups would be human connection, and that both groups are worthy of human connection, and at the root of what everyone needs is that human connection.
Love that, thanks. Yeah, human connection. Anyone else? So, the last question I want to skip to while we have a couple of minutes left. Do you guys believe that harm reduction can be practiced in someone's recovery? And if so, what would that look like?
Just to go back to your last question, so I work in domestic violence and sexual assault as well as recovery because there's such a co-occurrence within the both of them. So safety planning in any aspect of a person, whether it's their bodily safety, their use safety, I think is a good way to reduce the risk of harm in all aspects of their life.
Anyone else?
Well, I was going to say that a person in recovery would be almost a perfect person to practice harm reduction, because if they had experience in their recovery by, let's say, using medication-assisted treatment, for instance, which is harm reduction as well. So just being an example and practicing it.
Yep. And MOUD can certainly be considered a form of harm reduction in some ways. Anyone else?
I'm in a 12-step program, and I was about to collect my 6-month chip, and I had a big confession to make to my group, and I was worried that I had, I was going to have to forfeit this chip, this progress. I was going to go down that path, and according to my sponsor, like the level of acting out that I had did not violate my sobriety, and I was like, huh. So in a way, I did act out because bodies need to emote, bodies need to have a safe release. What I chose was not ideal, but it wasn't breaking my sobriety. So I had that hopefulness that, hey, I don't have to reset. I felt my emotions and I can move past it because I'm in a responsible culture and I feel like I can continue on. So I wanted to share that.
Thanks for sharing that. So personally, for this last question, and I know we're about out of time, but also it's important that something I've learned is like everybody's recovery looks different because everyone's addiction looks different as well, right? And so we might not hear from them, but there's a lot of people who might have a problematic relationship with one substance, right? And maybe they don't have a problematic relationship with other substances. That wasn't me personally. I had a problematic relationship with a lot of them. But there's a lot of people that aren't like me, right? And maybe they need to find recovery and start a pathway of recovery for one substance in their life, but maybe they were addicted to opioids, but maybe they drink socially. And it's not my place to judge, and that's practicing harm reduction in someone's recovery. So, anyone else have any thoughts before we wrap up? How much time do we have left? Like 0 minutes?
Yeah, 1.
1 minute. Anyone? We got 1 minute. Anyone else have any closing thoughts? Okay. So I'm gonna just pull up this last slide so you guys can get my contact information. The second link is our grants dashboard. I know the reason why I really kept these conversations on a particular topic is because I usually get funding-related questions when I'm up here. So if you do have any, I'd be happy to talk to you after, whenever, if you want to find me outside. So our grants are split into discretionary grants and block grants. Block grants go to our state partners. Discretionary grants go to our local community partners. And so I'd be happy to walk you through any questions that you have and make sure that you have what you need to access our grants portal. So with that, we are going to close off, and I believe Judy McGill is next. So.